Welcome to the Power Hour, Optometry's biggest and longest running show. I'm your host, Eugene Shatsman, and we've got a great episode for you today. In this show, I invited Dr. Jason Lake from some of the most successful membership groups in our industry to get some very interesting perspectives. Dr. Lake is a practicing optometrist. He's built a very impressive practice in Missouri. He also leads PERC and Optiport. These are membership groups, alliances, buying groups, whatever you want to call them. But in these two in particular, they're well known for the fact that their members outperform the industry, whether it's in growth or profitability. And Dr. Lake has a very unique vantage point because in his role, he has to zoom in on the practices that are doing well in his membership and then figure out what they're doing and make sure that that wisdom gets to the rest of the group. So I asked him today to share some of his findings, and we talk a lot about what it takes to make a practice successful. From what KPIs you should be watching, to what disciplines you should have, to what your recall and schedule should look like, and most importantly, the power of collaboration, the power of having a peer group that helps you and holds you accountable. And Jason shares some incredible insights. He does it in a pretty funny way at times, but if you really listen in, there are some pretty powerful practice building lessons throughout this episode. So before we jump in, I just want to remind everybody that I absolutely thrive on your feedback. It really helps me figure out ideas for future guests and topics. It helps me know what you like and don't like. It also helps me be a better resource for you. So a lot of people reach out to questions, and I can tell you it is my absolute pleasure to make sure that we address each and every one. So please reach out to me, eugeneshatsman.com, or the Power Hour website. And also, please make sure that you're subscribed on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, and now on to today's conversation. All right, Dr. Jason Lake, welcome to the Power Hour. Excited to have you on the show.
I am super jazzed to be on the Power Hour. Awesome.
All right, well, thanks for being here, Jason. And I think people heard in the introduction that you run PERC and Optiport as the general manager, chief kahuna, whatever you want to call yourself. Why don't you tell people a little bit about what PERC and Optiport is, and then we're going to get into some of the things that make practices successful.
Sure. PERC and Optiport, by their basics, their basic tendency are buying groups. We help independent ODs to purchase and to run their businesses at a higher profitability and more successfully. PERC tends to be larger 1, 2, 3 door offices that started by Dr. David Golden on the West Coast and it's kind of spread across the country. Very big offices. That's how Dr. Golden started. Optiport's a little bit different animal. It was started by Jim Edwards and Jamie Rosen, several other people. I think you've had a few of those as guests, industry pioneers. They started this a long, long time ago. Optiport represents about 70 entities that represent about 700 doors. These are multi-location offices that are operating really the biggest practices in the country. When you look at the Vision Monday Top 50, that if they're independent, they're probably an Optiport is a safe guess. So it's really based on scaling and, there's a lot of things that come with that. Certainly, those offices have unique needs to be able to run their businesses well. And we try to help them meet those needs.
Yeah, and it's not just a membership organization. All of this comes with a deep level of understanding of what these practices do and what these practices did to actually end up in some of these groups and be successful. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I think it might be relevant for people to get a little bit of your backstory because you're still a practicing optometrist. You still see patients. You have a practice, and that practice has grown tremendously over the past 26 years. So talk about your background and then also talk about what led you to get involved with groups like this and why it's important.
I'm glad you have a long podcast because this story alone can take till Thanksgiving. So I grew up on a farm in central Kansas, and my brother and I are the first two people in our family to go to college. And so I kind of ended up in optometry school without probably a lot of knowledge of how to make things like that work. My wife was a year behind me in optometry school. We came to Warrensburg, Missouri, which is in western Missouri, close to Kansas City. And we bought a small optician office that was doing about $300,000. And we probably got taken to the cleaners on the deal. Turned out okay. And then we, as we started to build, because we needed gainful employment for both of us, we bought another office 30 miles away, and then we bought another and another and another. I don't know that we had a grand plan to get and do what we're doing, but I think the plan started to materialize probably in the recession of 2007 and 2008 when margins were shrinking, I didn't know what I didn't know, but I knew we had to get a lot bigger to be safe, to be able to insulate ourselves from that. So really it was the two of us leaning in, and, we bought many offices in the area, and we kind of grew it out that way. We knew that there was safety in numbers and size. That also allowed us some freedom to negotiate better deals because we controlled a large geographic area. And there wasn't a grand master plan. It was just show up every day and hustle, right?
Well,
And so
but
that's kind of how it evolved.
some of the things I've heard is that you've always been a little bit obsessed with data, and some of the ways that you've gotten data have been a little creative. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, I know the story you're probably referencing. And in the early days, when we had yellow pages, there was no Google. And I speak to students a lot. I was like, everything you need is on Google. But in the olden days, it was not. If I was going to purchase an office, I have been known to sit in a parking lot and count patients and staff coming in and out to get an idea of patient flow that was going on. There was no way to do that back then. Now with Google and analytics, what you had to try to figure out was what was going in, what was coming out, and you knew what you could do with them once you got them. And so before I had a target, I would go watch it for a while just to see if it was what I thought it would be before I had that conversation. So the main reason we got into data, my wife and I were probably in practice 2 or 3 years, and we thought we were failing. And I don't think we realized that it just took time. And neither one of us are incredibly patient people. So I hired a consultant early on, and probably 3 or 4 years in, we started tracking 8 or 9 metrics, total exams, revenue. And that was a good starter and primer. And I taught myself Excel spreadsheet. That was very new back then, the Excel spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
And we started putting all that data into the spreadsheet, and we started building graphs out of it. And one KPI led to the next KPI. And that ability to track that data, honestly, just calmed my nerves. I'm a very entrepreneurial person, but I'm very positive, but I worry. So that ability to watch that and to understand that just because you had a bad month, when you look at the trend line, it's just a bad month, and to start to understand that kind of got me really into KPIs. And that's when we got into study groups. And so then I had a lot of other businesses that I actually would benchmark their data for them, because that led me to understand how other businesses operated. Somewhere in the early to mid 2000s, I started a business where I did help people buy and sell practices because I needed to learn how that worked. And so the ability to look at literally hundreds of P&Ls over the last 26 years, probably thousands at this point, led me to understand how the hydraulics of a business worked. And the more I dug in, the more we realized little changes on things and monitoring, from staff productivity to the way you purchase things, have significant differences in how you drop down profitability and EBITDA to the bottom line. So it's a bit of a labor of love and a bit of labor of probably type A anxiety-ridden crazy personality that drove a lot.
But you just said it, and I think it's so interesting and important for people to realize that data isn't necessarily extra work; it's peace of mind, because understanding what how the business is operating gives us context to say, how is it operating relative to last month, last year, my cohort, which might be all the businesses in my area, might be all the businesses of my size. All of that data gives us peace of mind to say, I'm either doing well or there's an area that I need to focus on, and I at least know where I need to look.
Right. I think not only does it give you peace of mind, it gives you confidence. I think one of the things that we've learned over the years as we've bought offices, we've, knock on wood, had a doctor retire, but everybody we've ever acquired or merged with has stayed with us through time. Is usually we can come in and make an office more profitable, and they can make more money working 2 or 3 days a week than they were working in a full week. And that confidence, knowing that trend lines through time, you're going to have downward slopes, but they come back up if you do the basic things. That gives you the confidence to expand. Without data, it's like a gas gauge in a car. You can have a general feeling that you should get 400 miles, but I prefer to have the hardcore data. Yeah, I prefer a promise more than a suggestion of good luck. So I think that confidence helps to spur you on, whether it's new acquisitions, hiring new doctors, expanding your enterprise. Data's key. And it's, unfortunately, in our field, Eugene, As you well know, data is unfortunately not embraced as well as it should be. And when you don't have data, in lieu of that, you make emotional decisions. So in those downturns were our biggest upturns. And that allows you to be prepared for inevitable downturns in the economy. Those were the best times we ever had. It wasn't enjoyable, but we knew that there would be another side to it.
So, this is interesting. And I think there's more we should talk about on the data side. So I'm going to put this on the shelf for just a moment.
Sure.
And you said something, though, that I think our listeners are going to appreciate, which is that you, every time you bought an office, you, Dr. Lake, not some, a big bad private equity group who came in and fired everybody, but you, Dr. Lake, helped make the office more profitable. So what are the
Sure.
kinds of things that you've done in your experience and that our listeners can take away when you think about, maybe a hit list of top 3, top 5, whatever you want to talk about, Jason, where it's you do this thing and almost inevitably the office becomes more profitable and allows you to maybe zoom in and focus in on just those things?
Gosh, I think the number one thing that you figure out is scale. Leaning into organizations like PERC or Optiport have always been helpful because they allowed us to create scale when we didn't have it. And as we got bigger, we became Optiport members before I ran Optiport. That scale allowed us to scale even harder, right? When you join others, that's the whole point of that. But what we find most often is that doctors don't manage the business. And doctors are extremely good clinicians and probably far better clinicians than I am at this point in my career. But what they don't do is manage the business. And you have to be able to get down, whether it's cost of goods or managing staff and looking at productivity. You can't do it based on emotion. And if you don't have a metric to do that, we can come in and benchmark. What we would do is we would come in and benchmark the office as it existed today. And I'm sure private equity does a version of this, is there's implied EBITDA. We know that if we put our systems in, it's going to profit this much based on our scale and the way that we run things. And so we've had great success. Now, listen, scale and profitability is not for everyone. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every time we bought an office, the doctor always ended up happy, but a lot of the times you would see half the staff jettison. Accountability is tough and it's not for everybody. And so I would say the other big thing is we use the entrepreneurial operating system. It's an EOS. It was a book. I don't know that there's magic to it, but having a system with regular meetings and statistics that the staff are held accountable to created that momentum. And like I said, people would sometimes leave, and that's okay. You can't be everything to everybody. But what we found was when we did that, the patients received better care and the business started to run like a business versus what it usually prior was. We were able to streamline those things. So I know that's real fuzzy. Readers are like, well, how'd you do it? You just run it like you're running your present business, because most businesses aren't run like a business. Optometry clinics are generally ran as 3 or 4 staff, the doctor's in the back of the house, and they're hoping that the staff doing everything right. In most of the case, the staff are making decisions without data. They're super capable of running it, but in light of data, it becomes almost whimsical. Particularly frame buying is the biggest one we see for profitability. Is, well, I like that rep, so that's where we're going to buy. And in reality, you can't run a business that way.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like you're hitting on 3 points. Number one is accountability with the team, right? Being able to hold your team accountable to doing the things they're supposed to be doing. That's powered by data in many ways, because you have to have the data to be able to hold someone accountable. And then number 3 is efficiency from, whether it's your purchasing. And on the other side, what I would add to that is that there are clients who start with us and they're good, successful practices. And we look under the hood and their recall systems, I mean, they're talking to patients after, if a patient's missed their appointment at 13 months, maybe they have a piece of software that'll send something out every 6 months. And, it's kind of a text message that sounds exactly the same every time. And then people hit unsubscribe. Or worse, I've had practices that, again, nice, successful practices that become marketing clients, and they're talking to us about, oh, let's get some new patients. Let's get excited about new patients. And what we find is that, you're still sending postcards via direct mail to try to get recall. And that's a huge, huge, huge expense. Let's make that a little bit more efficient.
Well, it's funny you bring up recall, because I'd say it's, if KPIs are number 1 or number 2, this would be the opposite. I'd say it's the most important thing. I'll give you a secret. I don't know if Dr. Jerry Ledgerton listens to your show. He's a brilliant man. He's from out in San Diego. He was my first consultant. I somehow conned this guy to fly in from San Diego to help me buy that office when I was 26 and fresh out of school. I don't know that he ever thought he'd be eating prime rib in Warrensburg, Missouri, talking business with some 26-year-old hick. But if you're listening, Dr. Ledgerton, thank you. Man was a genius. And I would say, I remember one thing he told me straight up. We were working through and he was showing me how he valued the practice and so on and so forth. And he said, Jason, how do you build a practice? And I said, well, I'm going to get a whole bunch of new patients. And he kind of shook his head and he said, no, you build a practice with established patients. And so that really struck hard with me. And so I'm going to vary a little on what you say, Eugene, because I'm a little old school, but I will tell you the number one thing I look at when I buy an office is I ask somebody, this is if you're looking to acquire, this is the number one ticket, is I say, show me your recall system. Oh, yeah, we have a very advanced recall system. We send out this letter, we do this. And I said, well, show it to me. And I walk up front and Bob or Sally or whoever's at the front desk, I said, show me your recall system. Inevitably, they open a drawer and there's like stacks of postcards and I'll pick one up and I go, I noticed this is like from 18 months ago. Yeah, we've been real busy. We haven't had time to send the postcards. And I'm like, you like being real busy? And so they go, yeah, we pre-appoint. And I said, well, show me that. Well, if the doctor says pre-appoint. I said, well, how often does that happen? Well, 3 times a week we pre-appoint. So the first thing I can do is if I go in and see a bad recall system, I know that I'll grow 20%. Now it takes a year. It's like planting a tree, right? The wisdom is the man who plants a tree knowing he'll never see the shade, or there's some fancy quote like that. You actually get to raise these crops. It just takes a year for it to work because you've got to get that buying cycle, which is probably 24 to 26 months. We found that it went to 18 months the first year and down to 14, which is what we averaged. And you're going to laugh at this, Eugene. We've argued. We still send a self-addressed stamped postcard for a pre-appoint. Now, we do track that. Now, I will tell you immediately once that postcard's sent, we go immediately into the Eugene Shatsman system of automated text, email. We go to the automated system after the initial encounter. Now, I think people kind of make fun of my postcards. I think one year we sent 24,000 postcards, not that long ago, the last time we counted. I would tell you the biggest, once you have a little bit of scale, the number one statistic that you ought to be looking at in your practice by doctor and by location, if you're multi-door, looking at those postcards and looking at those prior year exams and having someone who owns that statistic. And we were able to average in the mid 70s on recall. You're losing 15% a year for just sheer attrition. People unfortunately pass away, they move, but you've got to keep those new patients. People often will bring to me, yeah, I'm doing great. My new patients are in the mid 30s, almost 40%. And I'll say, well, how long have you been here? And I go, well, 10 years. That number's frightening. That means you're not keeping anybody. Yep. And so that new patient combined with how you're aggressively doing recall will tell me everything I know. I've never had it fail. We will take over an office that we can go in and install pre-appointing. We will see a 20% jump that first year, 15s usually for a couple of years thereafter, just because we shorten the buying cycle. And what happens is those patients generally, they're much happier. They come in, they get the care they need. The doctors are happier, and by providing better care, certainly the profitability increases as well.
Well, and it's interesting because I think when I've talked to practices before we explain our system, I think traditional wisdom says, okay, you want to talk to a patient, not, after 36 months, they're never coming back, and so the traditional wisdom is, okay, if a patient's missed their appointment, I think there's a difference between recall and reactivation, right? So if you're trying to get them to show up at 12 or 13 months, that's a little bit of a different communication cycle than if they've had an appointment, they missed that appointment, and it's been 3-6 months since then, and then you're hitting them, I don't know, most times once every 6 months with some sort of text message or email that they generally ignore. And then after 36 months, most people stop communicating. One of the things that I've seen that, almost immediately drives patient volume is you just look at that ignored population of people who you haven't communicated with all that much. You dig deep And I've dug as deep as 72 months with some clients that were comfortable with it, but we dig deep and we send all those patients, not just, hey, you missed your appointment 6 years ago. So I'm reaching out to remind you because I all of a sudden I care. No, you start sending high value content that gets people excited about potentially doing business with you again. And that high value content, whether it's fall fashions for your face or a reminder about a specific eye condition or the link between eye health and general wellness and that kind of thing, all of that starts putting together a picture in someone's mind that you actually care. And that's an easy way to do demand generation in a practice whether you're acquired or whether it's a practice that just needs a little bit more volume.
It's funny. We learned that the hard way. When we first started, we were all of our practices we came into Kansas City, but we were really rural, 30 to 50 miles outside of Kansas City. My friend, Dr. Lisa Wade, refers to those practices as prosperity practices, and they are, because you do a lot of medical, and it's a great way to practice optometry and be engaged. But if you want to be good at recall, put yourself in an area that the population doesn't grow. So I looked at recall really, really differently. My wife said it best, and Susie would always say, we always tell people to calm down and relax, but that's not how we run our business. We kind of panic at everything by design, because the reality is there's only so many people in this county and in this town. And when you lose one, it's not like Chicago or Houston. When we were in rural Missouri, there is no influx of people coming in. You bet every one of those are a precious asset, and you better fight for them. It's kind of like was it Rocky IV when Rocky went to train in Russia because he was going to fight Drago in Russia? Yeah, I mean we were in the hinterlands of western Missouri with no population growth. So to grow the clinics, we either had to acquire them, and once we acquired them, every single patient we fought like crazy, which is why we got really, really good at recall. And perhaps we got good at it before the advent of technology, but I would tell you in our groups, when I talk to doctors, they just assume people are going to come in. And I couldn't agree with you more, Eugene. There's no easier patient or customer to reacquire than the one you already had, assuming you did a decent job.
Okay, so we talked about recall. Let's talk about other KPIs that you're watching or other KPIs you think people should be watching.
Thank goodness this is an hour-long program, because there's 25, and we'll start at the top and we'll go down.
Could you read it in the most monotonous way possible?
Page 1.
Yeah, right.
There's the obvious stuff that I would tell you. KPIs are a funny thing. Being in groups, mastermind groups, for over 20 years, it's the biggest sign of growth and helped me to grow the practice. But the data is what holds people accountable. And I would tell you, there's the obvious things that people track, like what's your revenue, new patients, established patients, optical sales, and all those things are as sometimes as inefficient as practice management classes are in optometry school. People know that. I think where you get really good are the metrics people don't think about. One of the things we look at is staff hours per refraction. Knowing that what it costs me to staff an office in rural Missouri is different than my friend Dr. Aaron Sacco in Los Angeles, right? He's got to pay more. You can't look at staff. Certainly you need to look at staff costs, but it's just, I can do it for less money because it doesn't cost me as much money. I look at doctor hours per refraction. I look at doctor productivity per hour. Knowing when you are at your peak is when you are producing a certain level. It's what drives your income. It's when the office is most efficient. I think those productivity metrics are really, really important. I think one of the mistakes that people make is they don't take the time to benchmark their profitability as well. So I think knowing and breaking down by category, what's your cost of goods metrics per frame, per lens, per contact lens, and what's the marginality related to that. I see for struggling practices, it is not uncommon for me to walk into an office and ask them for a formulary. They're using a dozen different progressives. They're not buying right. I think learning what that number is and managing to it and setting with a group of people that are similar, and then your number's out of whack. I can tell you one of the benchmark moment for Susie and I was sitting at a meeting one time, and we started tracking average contact lens sale per fit. And when at profitability, I was the number one in the group, and it wasn't particularly close, but I think I can remember it vividly sitting there, and my average profitability sale per fit was like $140. And I can remember thinking, well, yeah, my percentage of profit's real good, but we're not fitting any daily disposables. And so those numbers can be deceiving. We certainly dove into dailies at that point years ago, and we realized, yes, the profitability marginality certainly dropped, but I have yet to be able to fill my gas tank with a percentage point. It's usually in dollars. So it's not just tracking those metrics of profitability, but understanding I'd rather have $200 than a higher margin percentage. So understanding productivity for staff and doctor, understanding profitability in those specific products. And I will tell you, I'll give you a little shout out here, Eugene, working with National Strategic, understanding our marketing. Yeah, I like to make the marketing joke, which you cringe at, but I'll make it on live. 50% of marketing works. The problem is nobody knows what half that is. And I remember the day I hired you, I challenged you to that. And that absolutely has been a boon for us. I see doctors that do not spend even 0.5% of their total income on marketing, and then they wonder why they don't grow. And you can't just throw dollars at Google AdWords. I think it's a long-term, it's like recall. It's a long-term SEO strategy, monitoring that spend and monitoring your recall, which I consider internal marketing, spend and the profitability you're getting from those things. It's how you run your business. If I invest $1 and get 10 back, wouldn't you want to invest $2? And I think we as an industry, we get greedy, and marketing is the first place you cut. And in reality, when others pull back is when you got to go harder. And if you're not tracking that data, you don't know. So yes, we track 25 basic KPIs, but I think there's about half of those are ones that people don't look at because they're a little more complex to get. But I think you won't run your business well until you do look at those things.
Well, and Jason, I certainly appreciate the shout out, by the way. I won't let that go unnoticed. Thank you. I'll be sending your check later. But I think you make a really good point about being able to understand where the business is coming from rather than just using your bank account as a measure of success. Now, this is why, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the KPIs before we went into the mechanics, but you get the benefit as the general manager of PERC and Optiport. And again, I think what you said at the beginning of the show is really important. These are some of the most successful practices in the country, some of the most successful independents in the country. These are the people who, have been, and I've been fortunate enough to work with many of these folks, but they're the folks who, they consistently make the Vision Monday top 50 list, and they're recognized for their success. And it's not that these guys have, started with more money than anybody else. It's that these guys have a secret. And I think the secret is what you were just alluding to. And that secret isn't necessarily one thing they're doing, but it is a group of things that they're doing that's inspired by one action that happens twice a year. So talk about that.
Yeah, I think we hit on mastermind groups, and that's kind of the heart and soul, particularly of Optiport and PERC. In Optiport, we have a group called the President's Alliance, and in PERC, it's called the P3, which is PERC Pinnacle Practices. It's the study groups, and so we meet twice a year, and we have all the same KPIs and metrics that we scrape out of their practice management software and their accounting software. So you set with the same 8 to 10 practices every 6 months, and you set goals and you hold each other accountable. My friend Jamie Rosen always says it's the kitchen table board of directors. So you bring in what's the best thing I did and what are the things I need to work on. And, I don't want to sound cynical, but I don't know that there's a lot of original thought. What there is a lot of people who know how to fail forward. And if I can learn from your failure, I can accelerate my own growth. You start to see people like, hey, I opened another clinic location. I bought in another doctor, and here's why I did it, and here's the logic. And you start to see that the logic is not that complex, but it's already been done, so you don't worry about failing. Secondarily, I think when you're with that group of people, they become friends, and you have hey, I'm thinking about this piece of machinery. So when you do that, it absolutely explodes growth. Without a doubt, we look at our study groups are outpacing the industry 4 times. When we look at just, if you're talking just top line growth, and we certainly outpace people when it comes to profitability, because the number one thing we know is we did a 5-year study of our original study groups that started back in 2017. They grew their profitability by 5 points. I don't mean 5%. I mean 5 actual drop down points from the top line. And most of them, in that
So
5-year
meaning if
period,
my profit was 20%, I went to 25%.
yes, sir. The other thing is most of them almost doubled their top line growth. So there was nothing magical about what we did. We didn't even change the deals they got. What we did is we got them to lean into the vendors they had and to stop erratic buying habits. And that was part of it. The other thing is maximizing use of staff. And the big thing is starting to create infrastructure, whether you're one office or 10 doors, infrastructure certainly follows that. You need more infrastructure, more doors, but teaching people that, this is a controversial thing I'll say, but frequently the least profitable thing the owner of a practice does is see patients. It doesn't mean they're not going to do it, but that means the most profitable thing they do is when they put on their CEO hat and they don't dedicate that time. And those 4 or 5 hours a week, generally, if you break that down for profitability, are usually 3 to 4 times what they get working in the exam room. That doesn't mean I'm not promoting you get out of the exam room. What I am promoting is taking a half an hour a week, or a half a day or a day a week. And as you get bigger, more time, but don't let your practice, you have to cultivate it and work on it. I think that's what those groups bring. And if you've got that mindset for growth and you want to get better, I would encourage you, there's lots of mastermind groups. I think we do some really unique things with proprietary KPIs and the way we track it, but just an accountability group. And I don't care if it's exercise or, I do it with healthcare. You can do it with anything. And I think telling people what your goals are, well, I don't know. I think I read Harvard did a study. You're 1,000 times more likely to do something when you tell someone else.
Yep.
We make you write it down in our groups and it's posted so we get to talk about it for the next 6 months. That's accountability, and that's what drives it. There's no magic. It's just good common sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and you're kind of downselling it a little bit, or underselling it a little bit, but I do think that sitting in a room with people with everybody's KPIs open in front of everybody. I mean, obviously there's a lot of confidentiality and a lot of trust that takes,
Sure.
but you got 10 people who are sitting next to you who are also running practices, and everybody looks at everybody's numbers. And all of a sudden you look at your numbers and you're saying, man, my exam only number is the highest one in the room. What am I
Yeah.
doing? And what's the guy who's got the lowest number in the room, who's got
Right.
the 20% exam only? What's he doing differently? And then you start asking those questions, and all of a sudden you have this magic that happens where people start using each other's resources, and then they kind of commit and say, well, okay, well, I realize that my biggest problem is exam onlys, and I'm going to try to before I see this group again, I'm going to make a commitment and say that I'm going to try to solve that problem, right?
It was, I'll give you a fun example. We do an internet connection once a month with our groups, and I try to chime in where I can. We've got a lot of groups, 12 now, I think. But one of the participants was talking about recall. And I was following the thread, and I was just kind of watching the members comment. And this doctor made a comment. Yeah, you know what? I think you guys have convinced me that pre-appointing, I'm going to put it on my list to do. And I try not to jump in because you want it to be organic. And I finally couldn't help myself. I chimed in and said, listen, I've been kind of following this. I'm going to tell you, don't just put recall on your list. I need you to actually throw your list away and just put recall as your for the next 6 months. And when you make another 20% on your top and bottom line next year, you're welcome.
Okay,
And
so you're a fan of pre-appoint. Let's take a tangent for a moment. It sounds to me like you might be a fan of pre-appointing. Why don't people do it?
a couple reasons. Most of it's a fear in their head that's not realized. Staff will tell you, I'm painting with a real broad brush, but when you first do it, there is somebody who's going to complain. They will come in and I've been coming here 20 years. I don't know what I'm doing next year at this time. And they don't properly prepare the staff. You say, well, we don't know either. That's why, we're going to fill this in. If you want to change it, there's some scripting you need to do. They get pushback from 1 or 2 people the first week. And there is pushback the first year. And then the doctor doesn't hold them accountable, and the staff don't want to do it, and that's inevitably why it fails. And yeah, we tried it and it didn't work. And I go, well, it never doesn't work.
Okay,
It
but
just
hold
doesn't
on.
get
So that
executed
that
well.
that argument, I'm just going to toss that argument in the trash, because I think that the dentists, and we've had on this show, I've had one of the world's most successful dentists on the show, and we always look at adjacent business models and adjacent
Yeah.
industries. Look, the dental industry has had this on lockdown for a really
Oh,
long time. You got
listen,
to show up
every
every six
six
months.
months.
You literally, like, I have no idea what I'm doing in January, but I have a dental appointment in
Hey,
January, right?
they have us trained. We are ducks, man. I give my dentist the hardest time about it. I would tell you, if for optometrists back in the day, I think we've come a long way. But when I was early in my career, I used to read. There's a magazine called Dental Economics, and I used to read it cover to cover. And I mean, I didn't care about the dental ads, but the way that they looked at their business model was so. We modeled a lot of stuff we did, including recall, based on the dental model, because quite frankly, it just wasn't as popular. So I don't know how we turned study groups back to recall, but I would say learning from others. And one of the things that I think, if you're doing your groups right, people are going to bring in good books. And I think we learn more from other industries than sometimes we ever do from our own. And so that those things, I mean, it works every time. There is a fear that somebody's going to get mad. And yes, you might lose a patient, maybe even two. The thousands that you are going to gain in reciprocity are probably going to outweigh that. So
Well,
I
and I
think you
think
just got to get past the fear.
one of the arguments that I've heard is all these patients, fine, they'll agree to book an appointment a year from now. And then a year from now, my schedule is going to be full, and I'm going to walk into the office on Tuesday, and it's going to be, my schedule is completely full with people who I scheduled a year ago, and none of them are going to show up. And I'm just going to sit there, twiddle my thumbs all day, because these patients, they weren't really that committed when they scheduled that appointment.
Well, I think there's a magic to how you pre-appoint, and you've got to do, like you said, the digital follow-up, the 2 week, 1 week out. We find that about in a given month, about 60% of people keep 50 to 60% of people keep that original appointment. But if you don't contact them at 2 weeks and 1 week, what we did a study, and this was many years ago, just internally in our offices. And what we did was we broke out, like, what if we just send a postcard? We were getting 50, 55% success rate. And then when you added in the 2 week call, it seemed to bump up the recall percentage about another 10 to 12%. And when you added the 1 week recall, it bumped it another 10 or 12%. So I could watch the recall rates at each particular location. And if I saw one drop, I knew that somebody was missing a part of the step. And I would go back and say, show me the call logs of where you worked on this. And inevitably, they missed the 2 week or the 1 week. So to make it work, you're right. 25% of the people are going to fall off. And if they haven't confirmed within 2 or 3 days, they fall off the schedule. And inevitably, those people that want in that same day are going to do it. But I do want to point out one thing that I think is so important in this, Eugene, is a templated schedule. If you leave a schedule open, it will fill 100% of the time, and almost half of it will be profitable. The problem that we face is you ought to look at your day and say, I'm going to create 14 or 16 full exams and another 8 to 10 follow-ups, whether those be medical visits or contact lens checks or whatever. The only thing that goes in a full exam slot is a full exam. And it's just amazing to me. That's been another big trick, is I will look at a schedule for a doctor, and it is randomly filled with visits that have nothing to do with anything, that people didn't even want to come back for it. And what we find is that recall, when held to a templated schedule, is absolutely going to drive revenue, and it's going to make for happier patients. It just does 100% of the time. It never fails. I've never seen it fail. I'm sure someone will call you next week and say, well, it failed for me. You failed implementing it. I'm that confident in it. But I will say I have doctors that the two greatest lies ever told at the bar, and I've learned just as much sitting in the bar as I have sitting in these rooms sometimes. The number one is, I'm booked out for 2 months, and it's said with pride. And I'm like, congratulations.
That's a big problem.
Yeah. Like, what town are you in? Because I'll be opening an office real quick, like right next to you. Like, thanks for the advice. And number two, how big their office is, because quite frankly, they usually have no idea, and it's a lie. I think that is understanding that, you had asked about a statistic, and I know we're all over the place, tracking your capacity rate. Is if your worst problem is next year, you're so busy making money that you weren't making this year, hire another doctor. have a template. Look at how booked out you are. And when you are consistently at 85% higher capacity rate, in other words, your templates are full 85% of the month and there's no free time, then you need to hire another doctor, build a bigger location. Those are when you can start to make those really profitable, aggressive decisions. But if you don't have a templated schedule, you're going to think you're booked all the time. And you're right, you're booked. It's just not productive. I would open next to you every day of the week if you were booked out a month and a half, because that means all those people are going somewhere else. And you could be the greatest doctor in the world, but if you don't make the space for your system, they're just going to go somewhere else. They're not going to wait more than 2 weeks, not in a market where there's a optometrist on every corner.
Yeah.
In retail.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a really good point, is that structuring a schedule in a way that that preserves your ability to, not schedule patients out too far. Um, let's go back to KPIs a little bit, because, I tried to touch on one, the exam onlys.
You ever feel like this episode is like a kitten playing with a ball of yarn? It's just all over the place.
I think I get some of I always ask for listener feedback, and the ones that I get some of the best feedback on are the ones that are a little bit all over the place, but then there's some sort of central point that comes back around. So we're going to keep playing with this ball of yarn, but then eventually it's going to have to turn into a sweater that you can wear probably in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So
wrapping it up. Okay. Just want to make sure we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, no. So I think we talk a little bit about KPIs that people need to watch. And you talked about the profitability metrics, which I think you're right. Those are the non-obvious ones. And when you're thinking about, you mentioned earlier what your staff cost per refraction looks like, or doctor hours per refraction, right? Is that one? What else? What are other non-obvious KPIs that people compare? And you're talking about these mastermind groups where people are sitting twice a year, they're comparing, that give you the greatest amount of insight. Because I think revenue and profit, okay, that's really obvious. But in between that, there might be some other things.
I think you look at them like lead and lag measures, right? Like at the end of the day, the money that ends up in your account, that's a lag measure. There's nothing you're going to do about it. It's already in the account. You can't change what the prior month was, but what's the lead measures that lead into that? And by the way, I used to think, people have been tracking this stuff for a lot of years. And everyone's like, well, I only know one statistic that is owned by a human being. Exam Only is actually owned by Jamie Rosen. He's the grandfather of one stat, but everything else is.
And he's been on the show, so listen to that episode.
Yeah, I knew he had. That's why I mentioned it. I would say everything was probably started by Jerry Hayes back in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, he's the grandfather, the guy that I knew that tracked him. And I remember reading all his stuff. But the reality is that I think it's important that you track. People would tell you any more than 3 is a waste of time, and I think that's interesting, but it's not true. I think there's 20 or 25 things that we track. Maybe some of them aren't useful, but I would tell you, knowing them and knowing how you can change them. If you can't change it, then there's no point in tracking it. But those lag measures, like cost of goods and things, you have to track them to see how you did. But what are the lead measures? So what are your board turn rates? And are you looking at specifically, do you have someone in charge of looking at your frame boards and going, okay, we know that Ray-Ban turns at 4 times the rate of Safilo. And if it turns more than that, then I should put more of that in. And the problem is we fall in love with a representative sales rep, which is great to get great service. But the reality is that they're selling you something you're not selling. I would tell you the first 15 years of my career, I have a graveyard of frames that we never sold, but I was absolutely certain that in rural Missouri, every article I read told me I should have super high-end stuff. I don't know if you know this, Eugene, but $1,000 bejeweled frames aren't selling in rural Missouri.
As a marketer, I'm just shocked.
I can remember it, and I hope I don't offend whoever sells this. I don't know if it's still available, but Ed Hardy sunglasses, like with the diamonds and the dragons on them, we were certain they were going to kill. And they do kill in a lot of markets. They did not kill in rural Missouri. And the only people that ever wore them were my friends and family members, because I think we sold 1 pair. But obviously, those stuck out to me because I saw them on the frame board every day. But diving into those metrics. And the thing is, it's not your metric to track. That'd be another thing that I would think every metric should have a mini game based around it that you can affect. So mini games came out of the great book, The Great Game of Business, written years ago by a guy named Jack Stack. Out of Springfield, Missouri. It's a great read if you haven't read it. And the principles still hold true that everybody has a number is the basis of it. My friend Dr. Danny Clark does a program with it. The biggest and most important thing I think with mini games are how you drive lead measures. So in other words, it might be frame turn. And so you say, or how are we tracking? If we're going to we contact X company and we're going to do a special on this frame this month, are we tracking it? Do we know second pairs? One we practice a lot is transitions. We don't probably do as great a job with that as we should. We follow, person in my study group, Dr. Susan Keene, has a number that's obnoxious. It doesn't even seem real, and I know she does it. We were hoping to get to 25 or 30%. And when we started tracking it, we had our staff build a board, and they built these like little horses on a racetrack for each optician. And all of a sudden, transition moved. And so whatever metric you track, and if you'd like to know the 25 we track, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to share it, is you got to track it and you got to put somebody in charge of it. Obviously the things like top line revenue and things like that, they're there, right? But things that you can affect every day, like percentage of optos sold, transitions sold, second pair of computer glasses, sunglasses, any of those metrics in any of those areas you want to drive, you should at the end of the month look at the lag measures and go, hey, we're not good at this. Let's create a lead measure to get into that. So the other big thing is moving that mini game around after every 3 months. I think it's so important that you keep establishing new and different behaviors, and they don't stick and they fade, certainly like workouts and everything else. But looking at those mini games to drive those desired behaviors is so important, Eugene. So I know you said, what things do we look at specifically? I look at the lag measures, whether it's capture rate or second pairs, and then we create a metric to go attack that. So there's a lot of things we look at month to month or week to week that are based on something we're trying to affect, if that makes sense.
So, and actually, I want you to talk a little bit more about an example of what a mini game looks like in your office and how you would do that. So if whether it's second pair sales or something like that, how do you do it?
Okay, let's talk sunglasses. I am the least creative human being in the world. Like if you ask me to build something like you always make fun of my PowerPoint slides, Eugene, because there are a lot of words and no pictures. So I come up with the idea for the mini game and then I get out of the way. I promise every listener that you have, there's somebody on your staff that's crazy creative. And it's kind of like the reason the internet's funny. There's so many funny people out there. There's so many creative people. So we would go to our office manager, Ashley, and say, hey, Ashley, I want to drive sunglasses this month. And I can remember she came back in, and I think it was Ashley. I'm probably going to get it wrong, but remember the game Candyland?
Mm-hmm.
They built a Candyland board, and each of the opticians had a little piece. And for every sunglass they sold, they got to move along the Candyland board. And the prize at the end of the month, I think, was free ice cream. I'm going to tell you something. Nothing motivates like free ice cream. I'm talking the soft serve at Dairy Queen Grill and Chill across the street. They'll cut a person for some ice cream. And it is bizarre. That's the thing is it's gamifying the situation. So at the end of the month, whoever got the furthest along the Candyland board got to go get coffee at Starbucks or Dairy Queen ice cream or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be that creative, but we've had sailboat races and they draw these crazy poster boards. They're so cool and artistic. And then they build the game and they're in the middle of the staff room. They walk by them every day and they're talking trash on each other in a fun way. That gamification creates two things. Number one, winners are going to win. And that's what you want as a staff full of them. And those who don't win, they usually say it's stupid. And they usually we usually end up promoting them to excellence elsewhere because that is not their jam. And it doesn't always work. And our staff turnover is not magically low. But the people that really buy in and get it, they want to be entertained. They want to win. And if they can win in any small way, it's not the ice cream. It's the walking around with the ice cream knowing that you won. And I think that's what mini games are about. And I don't care if it's, I think Jack Stack used to have a metric. The janitor had a metric, something about clean floors. It's tell me how to win, I'll go win for you. And I think that's human nature, right? So I hate to be 30,000 foot, but it's really that simple. Look at your lag measures, figure out what you want to change, create a mini game to affect it, and then go for it. Whether it's exam only, capture rate, second pairs, it doesn't matter what it is.
So do you believe in spiffs on top of a mini game, or is the mini game enough to motivate people?
Yes. Spiffs talk, and I would say I didn't until I joined Optiport. I didn't understand spiffs, and so I probably didn't promote them. But I absolutely think spiffs work, and I see it work all the time. Really clever trunk shows, really clever. Hey, we're going to promote X brand, and I think one of the things that I hope your listeners listen to. What's awesome about our industry is we're not big, but we're big in dollars, but not big in people. Your vendor partners will help you. And I mean, your sales reps, those great reps, Amex, $10 Amex gift cards, Starbucks cards, they got them. They'd love to spend them. And if you looked at that vendor and said, hey, we're going to sell X frame, and if we make you the special for the month, we're gonna spiff our opticians $5 gift card to Starbucks for every 5 they sell. I don't know what that number may be. I'm making that up. And then combine with your vendor to get a cost break. Your vendor will probably pay for the spiff in gift cards or discounts on the frame. And the vendor wins because they moved a ton of product. The opticians win. I'm using the opticians on this particular example. And you win, excuse me, because it drives a ton of business. So I used to be adamantly against them. I think you need to set them up in such a way that they don't promote overselling, but they absolutely work 100% of the time. You got to be thoughtful about it. But I will tell you, a commission-driven system, they're hard to execute, but they work really, really well. And people in really, really big offices execute them. So I have seen some of our members execute those things, and I do not understand how they do it. But I've been to their offices, I see it work, and I'm like, wow, I really was not good at that. You're really good at that. And that's the point of the groups, right? Somebody's doing it.
And it's actually, so this is kind of a couple final questions that I wanted to ask you, because I think you have the perspective that very few people in the industry do, Jason. You kind of downplay it a little bit, but you do get to get pretty intimate with the operations of any practice in that group of 9,000 that are part of your membership organizations. And you get to see the top performing ones, and you get to know what they're doing, and you get a chance to look under the hood of this one particular best practice or that particular best practice and challenge them a little bit. And they view you as a leader, because you generally, one of the things that I've always admired about the way you run these groups is that you generally stand up every 6 months and you tell them what's working. And that's a really powerful position to come at and say, I've studied what you guys are doing. I've studied what's happening in the industry, and here's what's working and here's what's not working. So maybe for our listeners, just, I don't need you to give the full 2.5 hour to two and a half hour dissertation that you would normally give over the course of a couple day event. But maybe just summarize a few things that you see really working in today's environment, and that you see driving practices to success outside of simply being in a study group and talking about your metrics and having those types of quality conversations and learning from each other. I understand that's the secret to the success that you're talking about these practices having, but practically speaking, outside of some of the other things you've said, what's working today?
For starters, consultants, they're like a broken watch. They're right twice a day. Mm-hmm. I would say it is much easier for me to go into somebody else's practice than my own and tell you what's wrong with it, because it's not personal. If I have heard one thing over and over and over again is, you don't understand, my practice is different. I mean, I don't want to break it to you. It's not. You may do some subspecialties that are different, but they're kind of all the same in some regards, right? Certainly there's different practices. So I think if you're curious, you can learn from anybody. And I would say, if you want to know what really works, is those people that are curious are the ones that win, because they're willing to test. And so no matter what harebrained idea you come up with, because I'm sure some of the best harebrained ideas come into things now that work, those people are testing and split testing. if you are with a marketing partner or a retailer that is not split testing sales, it's certainly easier in multi-door. You can try something in one and not the other, and you've got a pretty good demographically reasonable way to look at things, but always testing. And I would say the second thing, and it's maybe too general, but I always think of the ham story, because I had to give you a rural Missouri colloquialism before this was over.
Oh, please tell the
Um,
audience.
it's they're making Easter dinner, and she says, "Mom, why do we cut both ends off the ham before we cook it?" And the mom didn't know. And she says, she asked her mom, Grandma, why do we cut both ends off the ham before we cook it? She didn't know. And they asked great grandma, why do we cut both ends off the ham before we cook it? And great grandma says, "When our old oven, it wouldn't fit, but you got this big oven. I don't know why you do it." I think being willing, those practices who are willing to challenge the status quo in their own practices and never stop evolving and learning. A good friend of mine always used to say, arrogance prevents learning. And that includes your systems. The practices that truly succeed assume that the sacred cow makes the best hamburgers. And you've got to go in, and if it, just because I've done recall a certain way for a lot of years, let's challenge it, let's blow it up, and let's do it. So there's no magic pill. It's challenging yourself. It's being curious and willing to change. And I think those people realize that change isn't always big things. It's 100 little things. Those are the practices that never stop changing and growing and evolving. They're always the most happy owners. They are not on the internet complaining that optometry sucks, because it doesn't. It's an awesome industry with so much promise. And number two, they're always the people with the biggest practices, and they're huge, and they're bordering on giddy and giggly at meetings, because it's all these new opportunities to change and mess with stuff. It's, I would say change is no longer, what's the quote? If you don't like change, how are you going to feel about being irrelevant? Because that's going to be way worse. And just those practices that are willing to test and challenge and change everything. You don't have to change everything completely, but 5% change every day, you stack it up. That's why the groups work, right? It's monthly accountability. It's 2% change per month added up, and that's like compound interest. At the end of 10 years, next thing you know, you wake up, you got a $5 million ops, and you're making $1 million a year, and you didn't even know how you got there. But you had fun doing it. And I think those people who get in that negative mindset, they're never going to win. And that's okay. That's a way to do it. It's just wouldn't be a way that usually wins at a high level, in my experience. That's really too high level for what you wanted. But
no, it's actually, Jason, it's perfect. And it's funny, the first thing you said was testing, because I think you've been to enough of my lectures and my talks that, it's kind of one of the things I always, I tend to end a lot of my talks with is people always ask me, what's the thing in marketing that's really going to push me to the next level? Come on, is it AI? Is it Google Ads? Is it this? Is it that? Is it YouTube? Is it TikTok? And my answer almost always, and it probably has been for the last 10 years, is I could tell you, but the most important thing is the discipline of testing, because even if TikTok is the thing that's going to truly propel your practice to the next level today, at some point, it's not going to. And if you don't have the data systems, which is what you talked about in the beginning of the episode, if you don't have the data systems to measure it, you're never going to be able to test it against something else. And everything that you're doing can be a product of a discipline to test and to evaluate whether that thing is contributing to the top line, bottom line, and any other line you want in your practice.
I can't agree more. That curiosity should drive everything you do. And I think doctors are so good at that when it comes to clinical treatments. Young doctors in particular come out, they've forgotten more than I probably know at this point, 26 years in. But we need to take that to our businesses as well, and how we operate that business, and how we are curious about how to better serve the patient, better serve the industry. I think that curiosity is probably why people are, those are the people that are listening to your podcast. It's not the negative Nancy's out there that are, woe is me, and this is all going to pot. It's not. It's going to pot for people who don't try, but for the people who listen to you and are listening to podcasts and sharpening the saw every day, I can't imagine a better industry to be in. I mean, the potential is limitless. And I think you can compound that success by being in the groups and doing the things we're doing. We're just teaching you how to do it faster. That's all. There's no magic. We just teach you how to do it a lot faster. and we throw really good parties. I mean, we have really good food.
You do have some of the best parties in the
We
industry.
do have good food, free
Yeah.
beer. That's my
Yeah.
motto. Free beer and make more money. It's
Yeah,
real
free
simple.
beer and they'll come.
It's a bumper
Jason,
sticker.
it has been so great having you on the show. I think you've shared a lot of wisdom, and hopefully we've made that cat playing with a ball of yarn into some sort of garment for some of the listeners. I really enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to future ones. Thanks for being on the Power Hour.
My pleasure, buddy. Take care.
Hey there, it's Eugene, and I've got a question for you. Do you do medical billing in your practice? What if we took 10 charts and looked at them pretty closely? Would they be good enough to pass an audit, or would you owe the insurance company some money? Or would there be some found revenue that you could put back in your pocket? So looking at 10 charts is a new service that's now available from the Power Practice, and it's called the Power Audit. What happens during the Power Audit is that some of the most knowledgeable billing experts in the country are going to do a friendly audit on your charts and see if they can find opportunities. By the way, in auditing hundreds of charts, 9 out of 10 charts they look at, they find something. And typically that something fits into 2 categories. 1, something that better protects your practice, or 2, something that can make you more money. In fact, almost every single audit they do uncovers underbilling areas where you can get paid more for what you already did. So let's just play it out.